CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, has a reputation. Everyone loves to hate it. Few truly understand it, and even fewer know how to use it properly. So if you've ever wondered how CVSS scores are calculated or what they actually mean, this video is for you. I'll break down the purpose of CVSS, how it works, and walk you through each metric that contributes to the final score. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in CVSS, but as a pen tester, I use it almost daily to help my customers understand how serious the vulnerabilities I find really are. This video isn't about debating whether CVSS is perfect, because it's not. But for most of us, it's the scoring system we're stuck with, so we might as well understand how to use it effectively. The most important thing to understand up front is this. CVSS measures the severity of a vulnerability, not the risk it poses. Now, there are some metrics that blur that line a bit, and we'll cover those later, but when reading a CVSS score, always keep in mind it represents how bad things could get if the vulnerability is exploited. When you score a vulnerability with CVSS, you'll get three things. The first is a vector string, which is a shorthand summary of the vulnerability metrics. The second is a numerical score from 0.0 to 10.0, always with one decimal place. The third is a severity rating, ranging from low to critical. If two vulnerabilities have the same vector, they'll always have the same score. But the reverse isn't necessarily true. There are often multiple ways to arrive at the same score using different vectors. Alright, let's talk CVSS 3.1, which is still the most widely used version today, since adoption of version 4 has been pretty slow. Why 3.1 and not just 3? Good question. CVSS 3.1 doesn't introduce any new metrics, it mostly just clarifies how existing ones are interpreted and slightly tweaks the scoring algorithm. In practice, CVSS 3.1 and 3 are nearly identical. Just make sure any calculator you use is set to 3.1. Now, let's get hands-on and walk through how to actually score a vulnerability using CVSS. Okay, so we're on the NIST Common Vulnerability Scoring System calculator. This is, I guess, the official calculator. As you can see, you can switch between CVSS version 3.1 and 3.0. We're going to stick to 3.1. Now, this calculator is very good. It gives a lot of options. It covers all three main metric groups: base, temporal, and environmental. It'll give you a CVSS score and a vector that you can use. Now, some people prefer other implementations of this calculator. Obviously, the CVSS algorithm is public, so there are other calculators online, and you might prefer to use those. If I'm only scoring base metrics, I might use this one. This is from js.org, I believe. Yeah, it's nice and compact. That's kind of why I like it. It gives you the vector, but the real reason is, honestly, yeah, it's just very simple to use. It has these icons that let you know which option is worse and the colors, right? So basically, if you hover over this, red effectively means that this is going to increase the score, whereas this yellow one is the slightly better option in terms of it will lower the severity, right? So if a vulnerability doesn't require any privileges to execute, that's bad. If it requires a low privileged account, that's okay. And if it requires a high privilege, that's better, because obviously the assumption is you don't have a high privileged account. It's nice and color coded and it has these icons, but we're going to stick to the official NIST one for this video. Like I said before, there are three main metric groups: base score metrics, temporal score metrics, and environmental score metrics. Of these three groups, the only one that is technically required is base score metrics. Every single one of these 8 metrics needs to have some value. Now, it can be none. All right, so in the instances where there's none, it can be none, it just can't be null, right? It can't be not set. If you start clicking around, you'll notice this CVSS vector up here hasn't changed. The score is still 0. But as soon as we complete these 8 metrics, we get a score. These ones are required. Temporal metrics aren't required. They're optional, but they might be useful if you're a pen tester because they can also adjust the score. Temporal metrics, the idea is you have a base score, which is the kind of, okay, this is how severe the vulnerability is without any context. Temporal is a measure of how that might change over time. time. So the idea is the base score should be pretty static, but a year from now, it might be slightly worse, it might be slightly better, depending on if there's been an official fix, for example, if there's exploit code that exists. Right? If it's in Metasploit, if there's a module in Metasploit, that makes it slightly easier to execute. Temporal score metrics change over time. The base ones never do. Environmental score metrics are interesting. As a pen tester, you will likely never adjust environmental score metrics, mostly because you don't really understand the environment. These are highly contextual. The customer, if you receive a pen test report with a CVSS score in it, you might add some of these environmental score metrics to that CVSS score to get a more accurate score for your system specifically. And again, these can increase the severity of the score, they can decrease the severity of the score, they can keep it the same. These are just interesting to use, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about these in a moment. Let's cover the base score metrics. And one nice thing about this calculator is if you ever need to understand what any of these options are, you can just hover over them and a tooltip will appear. So it'll give you a little paragraph about what this metric actually means, or specifically what this option means. We have 8 base score metrics. The exploitability metrics are the first 5, and then you have 3 impact metrics. And the impact metrics might look familiar. You've got basically the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But let's stick to exploitability first. The first one is attack vector. This effectively is where does the attacker need to be in order to exploit this vulnerability? And you have network, which is effectively just connected to the internet, right? So the attacker is just on the internet somewhere and can attack another internet connected machine. You have adjacent network, which is effectively meaning that they're on the same subnet or an adjacent subnet within some kind of internal network. You have local, which means the attacker is already on the machine somehow, right? They have some kind of reverse shell. They are able to run commands on some machine, right? Local access. And then you have physical, and physical is they're actually in front of the machine, right? They have to be physically present. They can't just have some kind of remote shell. For some whatever reason, they have to be physically present at the machine. Attack complexity is pretty self-explanatory. How complex is the attack? Low means specialized access conditions or extenuating circumstances do not exist. An attacker can expect repeatable success against the vulnerable component. Basically, very easy to pull off, right? So if there's low attack complexity, an attacker doesn't really need to do much recon. They can almost always attack it and get success, and they can repeat that attack. High is the opposite, right? So there are some conditions beyond the attacker's control, and a successful attack might not be able to be accomplished at will. Privileges required, right? So here's a good one. How privileged does the attacker have to be? And this is important. This is before the attack, right? Before they carry out the attack. A lot of people get confused over this one. There's this none option, low and high. So high generally means you have to have access to an admin account. Low means you have to have access to some kind of normal user account. And none means you don't have to have any access to an account before the attack. Here's where it gets a little more complicated. If there is an attack on, let's just say, a web application that requires you to sign in, you might think that would be low, okay? Because the act of signing in means that the attacker already has to have some credentials. That might be true. However, if there's a registration page, if this is an application that has a registration page which allows anyone to register an account, that means technically before the attack happened, the attacker had no credentials. They created the credentials and then they were able to attack it. So in that scenario, you've got to be a little bit careful with how you read this privileges required. In an Active Directory environment, for example, if you're just plugging in a laptop into some kind of Active Directory environment and you don't have any credentials, right, and you need credentials to attack something, that would be where low is, because you can't just register a new account in Active Directory without, from an unauthenticated perspective. So just be a little bit careful, especially with web applications. If there is some kind of registration function, you want to make sure you're clicking none here, unless it's something like, okay, you have to be an admin, right? So if there's an admin level vulnerability, that obviously is a little different. You can't just register as an admin. User interaction, again, is this one is kind of tricky. I've seen several bug bounty triagers get this one confused as well. But the idea here is that either a victim has to be an active participant, let's just say, in some way in this exploit, in terms of they have to click on something that triggers the exploit, or they aren't required. So either this attack can be carried off without anyone else doing anything, or it requires some kind of action by a user. There's some nuance here, right? So for example, an SQL injection, an attacker doesn't need any user interaction for, right? They are doing that SQL injection themselves. They're sending all the payloads to the server. That's just how SQL injection works. Cross-site scripting, that's where it gets a little tricky. Okay, so technically, if you're doing a reflected cross-site scripting attack, that requires the victim to open the URL that contains the payload, right? It's very specific. And so that would mean user interaction is required. You can't exploit cross-site scripting, a reflected cross-site scripting attack, if a user doesn't click on the actual payload link. When it comes to persistent cross-site scripting, this is where, again, it just gets a little tricky, but I would always set that to none. In CVSS version 4, this has actually been fixed a bit. For now, if you're using 3.1, I would set it to none. And that's because, yes, there is technically some user interaction required, but the fact is the attacker can embed the payload in some page, and it's kind of just assumed that a victim will click onto that page at some point. It's not some kind of like that attack can happen without the victim having to click a specific payload URL. So I would put that back to none. And people may disagree in the comments, but like I said, this has been fixed in version 4. I would say none here for persistent persistent XSS, but I would definitely put it required for reflected XSS. Okay, scope, unchanged versus changed. So unchanged means that the exploited vulnerability can only affect resources managed by the same authority. In this case, the vulnerable component and the impacting component are the same. Effectively, let's go back to cross-site scripting again. Cross-site scripting is exploiting the same application, right? So if you have a reflected cross-site scripting on a page in the application and you get to trigger it, the application's affected, the same application that you're putting the payload in. So the scope is unchanged. If for some reason you manage to get some kind of blind XSS, right? So it triggers at some backend system, like maybe a hidden admin panel on some other server. That's happened so many times in the past. There's so many bug bounties that have happened that way. That would be a changed scope, all right? Because even though you exploited application A in terms of embedding the cross-site scripting payload, where it was actually triggered was some other application. You could argue that SQL injection might be this as well. If you're thinking that the web application is maybe it's talking to some other database server at the back end, that also might be an example of where the scope is changed. You might not necessarily know this as a pen tester, by the way. You might not know whether the scope has actually changed or not. There is a little bit of guesswork here, but there are some examples. Most of the time, I think, for web app pen testing specifically, you might be able to say that it's unchanged. And finally, we have the impact metrics. So again, confidentiality impact. Basically, there's no loss of confidentiality for a none. Low means there's some loss of confidentiality. High means there's total loss of confidentiality. Integrity, exactly the same thing. None, low, and high. And availability, none, low, and high. These are interesting. Obviously, CVSS was not designed specifically for any kind of vulnerability. So when it comes to web stuff, it's a little tricky. So for example, SQL injection, you might put confidentiality as high, even though, you might not be able to access anything beyond the database. So you're not accessing files on the system. So when it says total loss of confidentiality, you have to be a little bit flexible with the words, right? You can compromise a lot of data in the database. Maybe you can't change the data using SQL injection. So integrity might be like none, right? And availability might be none here, okay? Unless you can cause some kind of denial of service, which point it might be low. You've got to play around with these a little. This is an art. art. It's not some kind of science, unfortunately. Take these definitions with a little grain of salt. So if you scored an SQL injection where you could literally access the entire database as low confidentiality, it's not going to get a high enough score to reflect how actually severe the vulnerability is. Even though it says here total loss of confidentiality resulting in all resources with the impacted component being divulged to the attacker. What does all mean? Does it mean all files on the database server? Probably not. But does it mean all data in the database, or at least a lot of data in the database? Yes. So again, play with these a little bit. Temporal score metrics. This is how the severity of the vulnerability changes over time. We have 3 metrics here: exploit code maturity, remediation level, report confident. Currently, we have a score of 5.9. Exploit code maturity effectively means, like, is there any code available that can exploit this vulnerability, and what state is that code in? If you're like scanning a network with Nessus and you come across some Nessus flags an issue, there's probably not many instances where you could say that it's unproven that the exploit exists. There are some, obviously, like theoretical attacks, but a lot of the time you won't be using this. However, there are definitely instances where Nessus comes back with a vulnerability, you do some searching, and you find proof of concept code, but not an actual functional exploit. So proof of concept code, if it exists, it's going to reduce the severity a bit just because it is only proof of concept. It means that it's not necessarily something you can use to exploit the vulnerability. However, if there's a functional exploit, that's increased it from 5.6 to 5.8. If there's a completely autonomous exploit code, that will take it back to 5.9 again. Remediation level means basically, hey, this vulnerability exists. Has the vendor actually fixed it? And in what way have they fixed it? All right, so official fix. That's great. So if we click official fix, the severity drops to 5.7 again. So official fix will take it to 5.7. If there's only a temporary fix, right? So if the vendor, for example, has only issued like some manual remediation guidelines, that's a temporary fix, or a hot fix, that again takes it down to 5.7. Workaround, for basically you have to like change some config, or you maybe, there's a specific guide that the vendor has released that's not a fix, but it like effectively negates the vulnerability in some way. With a workaround, that will bring it back up to 5.8. Unavailable, right? So the vendor hasn't fixed it yet. That takes it right back up to 5.9. And report confidence is an interesting one. So you got unknown, reasonable, and confirmed. This again is not really used much in pen testing, but it would be if there's details on a vulnerability that you found, if it's been reported in the wild. So yeah, like honestly, read these. These are kind of weird. I think they've been removed in version 4. But the idea is this vulnerability is like maybe kind of new. There's some interesting things that people have done with it, but it's not, there's no real actual proof that the vulnerability properly exists or that the impact is that bad. So, you can switch between these. Like if a vulnerability is actually being actively exploited, right, and there's detailed reports, especially from a vendor, you can put confirmed. If there's only blog posts, like by researchers, and there's no proof of concept and there aren't many details about it, you might put reasonable. If this is a vulnerability which people have talked about but there's not really any proof of that, you can put unknown. But to be honest with you, I don't use any of these because, if you're a pen tester, you should be confirming all your vulnerabilities anyway, right? So I usually would put confirmed or just not defined. Let's go back to environmental score metrics. So these are the interesting ones. These are the ones which pen testers won't really ever have to use. But if you're a consumer, if you're actually dealing with fixing vulnerabilities, if these vulnerabilities affect your environment, you might have some knowledge about your environment that makes these vulnerabilities either more severe or less severe. Right now, we've said right in the base score metrics that this vulnerability is a network-based vulnerability, okay? That means it's remotely exploitable. If you receive a pen test report for an internal network and you get this network attack vector, well, okay, that might be true, but let's just say that that the machine that this vulnerability is affecting is connected to some kind of remote, like a subnet that is only accessible from other subnets. It's not just accessible if you plug in. So you might be able to change that to adjacent network here. You'll note that in exploitability metrics, these are basically mapped, that they're the same as the base metrics. Okay, so you've got attack vector, attack complexity, privileges required, user interaction, scope, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then you have some impact subscore modifiers you can use here. These 8 over here are just the base score metrics repeated. And that's because these should never be changed, remember, never change these, but you can change the environmental score metrics. And so what we've done here by saying, so we had a 5.9 originally, 5.9 severity, by saying, okay, well, actually, this isn't connected to the wider network. It's on an adjacent network. So you have to be on an adjacent network to even exploit this. Well, suddenly we've reduced the severity down to 5.4. Let's say that this machine wasn't even connected to a network. All right. So it's not connected to a network. So in order to exploit it, you need to have physical access, right? Well, now you can click physical here and the severity goes down to 4.6. And that's the same through all of these. If there are environmental reasons why the base score metrics don't apply in your situation, you can change the environmental metrics, right? Privileges required, you might decide, oh, actually, even though this says that low privileges are required here, actually you need high privileges, all right? Actually, for some reason, you need to be an admin account to exploit this vulnerability in our environment. The same thing, confidentiality impact, integrity, availability, you can change these. So these are a kind of way of altering the base metrics to fit your environment a little better and adjust that severity score. What about impact subscore modifiers? These are effectively a way of kind of clarifying how important confidentiality, integrity, and availability are in your environment. It might be that there is a high confidentiality impact if this vulnerability is exploited, but you might consider that actually, even if an attacker can access all this data, that data isn't actually that important. For example, an SQL injection, they might only be able to access specific data that is literally just blog posts that are publicly available. There's no credentials, there's no customer information in the database that they can access. They aren't able to exfiltrate any other data than those specific blog posts, right? Let's just say that that's an example. Well, in that case, the blog posts are already public. So yes, they can access, we might say, okay, low, because they can already access stuff. If we click here low, loss of confidentiality is likely to only have a limited adverse effect on the organization. Well, yeah, because the data that they accessed wasn't that bad, right? It was just publicly available anyway. And so you can change the confidentiality requirement here. And the same for integrity and availability. Availability might be, okay, so if an attacker is able to knock over one of your servers, but it's a cloud server which is instantly replaced by another one as soon as that happens, right? So yes, they're able to perform some kind of denial of service attack, but the actual exploit itself doesn't really have any lasting impact because you have this ability to just completely spin up new servers in a matter of seconds. And so it's slightly less severe in terms of the actual impact that your organization has. And so that's what these requirement metrics mean. And again, so you can adjust them down, and we see now we've reduced this 5.9, right? Originally, this base metrics. You can see them over here. Base metrics 5.9, the impact 4.2, exploitability 1.6. We didn't get any temporal stuff, but yeah, that's how these metrics work. Always have a base score. You can adjust temporally over time, right? You can adjust these ones, and then the consumer, the ultimate person who's going to have to deal with these vulnerabilities, can add some environmental scores to give a little more context. And what I promised at the beginning, you'll get this lovely vector. So this vector, all it is it's every single selected one here, every single selected metric in a list separated by forward slashes. So here we go. We have attack vector AV set to network. That's AV:(N). We have attack complexity AC set to high. That's that's AC set to high, and we go all the way down. And if we disable some of these, right, if we put these back to not defined, then you end up with just the base score vector. Yeah, we have an overall CVSS score of 5.9, and we can adjust it using the rest of these. Play around with this is my advice, and make sure you hover over all these tooltips and read them, especially if you're in a position where you have to be generating these CVSS scores for something. Hopefully that explains what CVSS is and how to at least calculate the score. Hopefully this gave you a better understanding of how the scoring system works, what each metric means, and how to apply it in the real world. If you found this helpful, consider giving the video a like, subscribing for more web security content, and dropping a comment if you've got questions, or if you want me to make a follow-up video on CVSS version 4. Let me know either way. And until next time, happy hacking!